What if physics isn't actually real? Not in the way we think, not as something fixed, not as something absolute, but as something that slowly appears, something that forms when reality organizes itself in just the right way and disappears when it doesn't. We grow up believing that physics is the foundation of everything, the deepest layer, the rules that cannot be broken. Particles move the way they do because the laws of physics say so. Time flows forward because that's just how reality works. Space stretches, bends, curves, according to equations we've learned to trust. It all feels solid, reliable, like standing on bedrock. But there's a quiet assumption hidden inside all of that, so quiet, most people never notice it. The assumption that physics is the bottom. That if you keep asking why, eventually you arrive at particles, forces, space, and time. And that's where the questions stop. But what if that's not where they stop? What if that's just where we stopped looking? Because there is something strange about the way physics behaves, something easy to overlook, something that doesn't quite fit with the idea of it being fundamental. Let's start with something simple, something that feels completely real: temperature. You know what temperature is, you feel it every day: cold air on your skin, warm sunlight on your face, the sharp bite of winter, the heavy stillness of heat. Temperature feels undeniable. It feels like a property of the world itself. But here's the strange part. A single particle has no temperature, not a little, not even zero. It simply doesn't exist at that level. Temperature only appears when huge numbers of particles start moving together, when their motion becomes collective, when chaos turns into something measurable. In other words, temperature is not fundamental. It's emergent. It's something that only exists when reality reaches a certain scale, a certain complexity. And once you see that, something shifts. Just a little. Because it raises a question that is difficult to ignore. What else might be like that? What else feels real, but only exists because something deeper is organizing itself in ways we don't fully understand? At first, it seems like a small idea, harmless even, just a detail about thermodynamics. But if you follow it carefully, it doesn't stay small, because temperature is not the only thing that behaves this way. Take something even more familiar, something so obvious we rarely question it: sound. Sound feels real. You hear it, you recognize it, you react to it instantly. A voice, a melody, a distant echo. But sound doesn't exist in empty space. It requires a medium, air, water, something to carry vibrations. And more importantly, it requires many particles moving together, passing energy between them. A single particle cannot produce sound, just like a single particle cannot have temperature. Again, something that feels fundamental turns out to be emergent. And now the pattern starts to form. There are things in reality that only exist when enough pieces come together. They are real, but not fundamental. And once you begin to notice this, it becomes difficult to stop, because the next step is unavoidable. What if the same is true for something much bigger? What if the same is true for space? Space feels like the ultimate foundation, the stage where everything happens, the container of the universe. You exist in space. Everything exists in space. Every object, in every event, every moment. It feels impossible to imagine reality without it. But physics has been whispering something strange. For a long time now, something subtle, something easy to ignore if you're not listening closely. At the smallest scales, space does not behave the way we expect. Distances blur, positions become uncertain, particles don't sit neatly in fixed locations. Sometimes they don't seem to have a location at all. It's as if the idea of where something is starts to break down. And if where breaks down, then space itself is no longer what we thought it was. There are theories, quiet ones, still incomplete, suggesting that space might not be fundamental, that it might be something that emerges from deeper relationships. Not a container, but a consequence, a result of something more basic, interacting in a very specific way, like temperature, like sound, something that only appears when the system becomes complex enough. And if that's true, then the ground beneath everything isn't really ground at all. It's something forming, moment by moment. Now, pause for a second, because this is where things begin to feel a little unstable. If space is not fundamental, then where are you? Not metaphorically, literally. What does it mean to exist somewhere? If somewhere is not a basic feature of reality. It's a strange thought, the kind you don't sit with for too long. But we're not done yet. Because space is only part of the picture, there is something even more central, something even harder to question. Time. Time feels absolute, unavoidable. It moves forward, always. You remember the past. You experience the present. You anticipate the future. Everything is structured around it. But deep in the equations of physics, something unexpected appears. At the most fundamental level, many of the laws don't actually care about the direction of time. Forward, backward. The equations still work, which is deeply unsettling, because our experience of time is not symmetrical. We don't remember the future, we don't move backward, we don't see broken things spontaneously reassemble. Time has a direction, a clear, undeniable flow. And yet, the deeper laws of reality don't seem to enforce it, which raises a quiet but very serious question. What if the flow of time is not fundamental either? What if it's something that emerges, just like temperature, just like sound, just like possibly space? A result of deeper processes, statistical, collective, unavoidable at large scales, but non-existent at the smallest ones. If that's true, then the way we experience reality is not the base layer, it's the surface, a stable pattern, a consistent illusion, a useful approximation, but not the truth at the bottom. And now, without noticing exactly when it happened, the idea has grown. Physics, the thing we trusted as the foundation, is no longer the foundation. It's something that depends on something else, something deeper, something we don't yet understand. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, quietly, like a thought you weren't supposed to finish. Because if physics is emergent, and then the laws you trust are not absolute. They are conditional. They exist because reality is arranged in a particular way. And if that arrangement changes, the laws might change too, or disappear entirely. And suddenly, the universe feels different, less like a machine, more like a process, less like something built, more like something that is constantly forming. And beneath that formation, something else is happening, something quieter, more fundamental, more difficult to see, something that does not look like space, does not move like time, does not behave like anything we are familiar with, something that gives rise to everything without being anything itself. And we are here, inside the result of it, living in patterns that feel permanent, trusting rules that may only exist temporarily, standing on what feels like solid ground, but might not be ground at all, and just something that, for now, hasn't changed yet. There is a strange comfort in believing that reality has a foundation, something solid, something final, a place where the questions end. Because if there is a bottom layer, then everything above it feels secure, explainable, contained. But the idea that physics is emergent quietly removes that comfort, because if physics itself depends on something deeper, then what we call reality is no longer the base. It's a result, and results can change. This is where the idea becomes a little harder to ignore, because once you accept that some things are emergent, you start to see it everywhere, not just in temperature, not just in sound, but in systems that feel far more complex, far more real. Take something like a wave on the surface of water. A wave looks like an object. It moves, it has shape, it has direction, you can point to it, you can follow it. But a wave is not a thing. It's a pattern. The water doesn't travel with the wave. The pattern moves, not the substance. And yet, to your eyes, to your mind, it feels like something real is moving across the surface. Now imagine not just a wave, but everything. What if what we call particles are more like that? Not objects, not tiny solid pieces of reality, but stable patterns in something deeper, something we don't directly perceive. This is not just speculation, although modern physics already hints at it. In quantum field theory, what we call a particle is not a tiny ball. It is an excitation, a disturbance, a ripple in an underlying field. The electron is not a thing in space. It is something that happens in a field, a localized pattern that behaves consistently enough that we treat it like an object. But underneath that behavior, there is no solid core, just structure, just interaction, just pattern. And once you see that, the idea becomes difficult to ignore, because if particles are patterns, then what are they patterns of? What is the thing that is actually there? We don't have a clear answer, but we do have a direction. Some theories suggest that the deepest layer of reality is not made of matter, not made of space, not even made of time, but made of information, relationships, connections. Something more abstract, something that doesn't look like anything we're used to calling real. In this view, reality is not built from objects. It is built from interactions. And what we perceive as objects are just stable configurations of those interactions, like a knot in a network. The knot feels like a thing, but it only exists because of how everything around it is connected. Now pause for a moment, because this is where the idea becomes more than philosophical. It becomes unsettling. If everything is built from relationships, then nothing exists on its own. Not truly. Everything depends on something else. And if you follow that chain far enough, you arrive at something strange, a layer of reality that is not made of things but of pure structure. No space, No time, no objects, just relationships. And from that, everything else emerges: space, time, particles, forces, all of it, not as fundamental ingredients, but as consequences. This changes the way you have to think about existence, because if something is emergent, then it is not guaranteed. It only exists under certain conditions. And if those conditions shift, even slightly, the thing itself might vanish. This is easy to accept for temperature. You can imagine a system so small that temperature no longer applies. It simply stops being a meaningful concept. But now imagine that happening to something much larger. What would it mean for space to stop being meaningful? What would it mean for time to stop existing as something that flows? It sounds impossible. But that feeling comes from intuition, not from physics. Because physics, at its deepest level, has already started to move away from those intuitions. It has already begun to describe a reality that does not look like the one we experience. A reality where location is uncertain, where causality becomes blurred, where events don't follow a simple timeline, and where the very idea of before and after can lose its meaning. This is not science fiction. This is the direction modern theories are pointing, quietly, carefully, without making too much noise about it, because the implications are difficult to sit with. If space and time are emergent, then the universe we experience is not the true structure of reality. It is a projection, a stable layer, a consistent interface, something that allows us to navigate the world without seeing what's underneath, like a map. The map is useful, reliable, accurate enough, but it is not the territory. And if you mistake the map for the territory, you never question what lies beyond it. Physics might be our map, a very precise one, a very powerful one, but still, just a map. And maps are built from patterns we can understand. They simplify, they compress, they translate, they turn something complex into something usable. But in doing so, they hide detail, they hide depth, and sometimes they hide the truth. If physics is emergent, then the equations we trust are describing patterns, not fundamentals. They work because the conditions of our universe make them work. But those conditions are not guaranteed. They are part of the system, not above it. And this leads to a thought that is difficult to ignore once it appears. What if the laws of physics are not universal? Not in the absolute sense. What if they are local? Context dependent, true here, true now, but not necessarily true everywhere or everywhen. There could be regions of reality where space behaves differently, where time flows differently, where the patterns we recognize as particles don't exist at all. Not because the laws are broken, but because the deeper structure is different. And if that's true, then our understanding of the universe is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally limited, bound to a layer of reality that only exists under very specific conditions. We are studying the surface and calling it the whole. And maybe that's enough for now, but it doesn't answer the deeper question. What is actually underneath? What is the thing that gives rise to everything we see without being anything we recognize? And why does it organize itself in a way that produces a universe like this one? A universe with structure, with consistency, with laws that feel stable enough to trust? Because if those laws are emergent, then their stability is not guaranteed forever. It is something that must be maintained, something that must continue to hold together. And that raises a final thought, for now. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet enough to stay with you. If reality is built on something deeper, then the question is not just what that deeper layer is. The question is, what happens if it starts to change? There is a point where an idea stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. Not because it changes the universe, but because it changes how you exist inside it. The idea that physics is emergent is one of those ideas, because up until now, it's still possible to keep some distance. You can think about particles, fields, equations, concepts that feel far away. But eventually, the question turns. And it turns towards something much harder to ignore. If reality is built from patterns, then what are you? Not metaphorically, not philosophically, physically. What are you made of? If the things you're made of are not truly things, your body feels solid, stable, continuous. You move through space. You experience time. You feel like an object in a world of objects. But at the smallest scale, none of that is actually true. Your body is mostly empty space, not just a little empty, almost entirely empty. Atoms, which make up everything you are. We are vast regions of space with tiny concentrations of energy, and even those particles are not solid. They are patterns, disturbances, localized behaviors in something deeper. There is no hard core, no tiny sphere sitting at the center of reality, just structure, just interaction, just probability, and yet you feel solid, you feel continuous, you feel real. That feeling is not coming from the fundamental layer, it's coming from the emergent one, from the level where patterns become stable enough to behave like objects, where interactions become predictable enough to feel like laws, where complexity becomes structured enough to feel like reality. You are not a thing. In the way you imagine, you are a pattern that persists. A stable configuration in a constantly changing system. And that stability is not absolute. It is maintained, moment by moment, without you noticing. Now, pause here. Because this is where the idea becomes unsettling. Not dramatic, not loud, just quietly difficult to sit with. If you are a pattern, then what happens if the pattern changes? Not slowly, not over time, but fundamentally, at the level beneath everything you experience. We usually think of change as something gradual, aging, growth, decay. But those are changes within the system, changes that still follow the same rules. What we're talking about now is different. This is change in the rules themselves, change in the layer that produces the rules. And if physics is emergent, then that layer is not fixed. It doesn't have to produce the same patterns forever. It just happens to right now. That's what makes reality feel stable. But stability is not the same as permanence. It is something that holds until it doesn't. There is a concept in physics, quiet but important, called phase transition. You've seen it before. Water freezing into ice, water boiling into vapor. At one temperature, it behaves one way. At another, it behaves completely differently. The underlying molecules haven't changed, but the pattern has. And when the pattern changes, the properties change with it. Solidity appears or disappears. Structure emerges or collapses. Now imagine that idea not applied to water, but to reality itself. What if the universe has phases? Not just different states of matter, but different states of existence where the underlying structure produces different emergent behaviors, different laws, different rules, different realities. And we just happen to exist in one of those phases. A stable one, a predictable one, a phase where space exists, where time flows, where particles behave consistently. But that doesn't mean it's the only phase, or the final one, or even the most stable one. It just means it's the one we are inside. And from the inside, it feels absolute. Of course it does, because everything we experience is built from it. But that doesn't make it fundamental. It just makes it consistent. There's a subtle difference there, one that's easy to miss. Consistency can emerge, fundamentality cannot. And once you understand that difference, something shifts again. Because now the universe doesn't feel like a fixed structure, it feels like a state, a condition, something that could, in principle, be different. Not through destruction, not through collapse, but through transformation. Like ice becoming water, not disappearing, but becoming something else entirely. Now think about what that implies. If the universe can exist in different phases, then the laws of physics are not universal truths. They are phase-dependent behaviors, local rules for a particular state of reality. And if that's true, then the deeper layer, the one beneath physics, is not bound by those rules. It is the thing that generates them. And we have almost no direct access to it. We infer it, we model it, we guess, but we don't experience it directly. Because our entire perception is built from the emergent layer. We are inside the pattern, trying to understand the system that created it, which is a strange position to be in, like a wave, trying to understand the ocean. You can describe your motion, your shape, your behavior. But the thing you're made of remains just out of reach, not because it's hidden, but because you are it, and that makes it invisible. Now there is one more step, a quiet one, but important. If reality is emergent, and if it depends on deeper structure, and if that structure can produce different phases, then there is a possibility that is difficult to ignore. We are not at the bottom, not even close. There could be layers beneath layers, structures beneath structures, each one giving rise to the one above it, each one more fundamental and more abstract than the last. And somewhere down that chain, something exists that does not emerge from anything else. Something that simply is. But we don't know what that is. We don't know if we can ever reach it, or even understand it. Because everything we use to understand reality is built from a layer that may not even exist at that depth. And that leaves us here, in a universe that feels solid, built on rules we trust, experiencing a reality that behaves consistently enough to believe in. But beneath that consistency, something else is happening, something deeper, something that does not look like space, does not move like time, does not behave like anything we recognize. And yet, it is the reason anything exists at all, including you, not as a thing, but as a pattern that, for now, is still holding together. There is something else, something even closer than space, closer than time, closer than your body, your experience. Not reality as it is, but reality as you perceive it. Because everything we've talked about so far still assumes one thing, that even if physics is emergent, we are somehow seeing it clearly. But we're not even close. What you experience is not reality. It is a reconstruction, a filtered version, a simplified layer, a translation built by your brain. Right now, you feel like you're sitting somewhere, in a room, in a space, at a specific moment in time. You feel continuous, stable, present, but none of that is directly given to you. Your brain builds it from fragments, light hitting your eyes, signals traveling through neurons, electrical patterns moving through networks. There is no direct access to the world, only interpretation, only reconstruction. And that reconstruction is not perfect. It doesn't need to be. It only needs to be useful. Your brain is not trying to show you reality. It's trying to help you survive, which means it simplifies, it compresses, it fills in gaps. It creates continuity where there might not be any. Take something simple, vision. It feels smooth, continuous, like a live feed, but it's not. Your eyes jump constantly, small, rapid movements. Between those jumps, your brain fills in the blanks. It stitches together fragments into a seamless experience. You never notice the gaps because the system is designed to hide them. Now extend that idea. What if the same thing is happening at a deeper level, not just in perception, but in reality itself? What if continuity is not fundamental? What if it's something that is constructed moment by moment, just like your visual field? There is a growing idea in physics, quiet but persistent, that reality might not be continuous, not at the deepest level, but discrete, made of tiny units, tiny steps, tiny transitions, so small, so fast, that they blur into something smooth, like frames in a film. When you watch a movie, you don't see individual images, you see motion. But the motion is an illusion, a result of discrete frames shown in rapid succession. Reality might be doing something similar, not a continuous flow, but a sequence, a progression of states, each one giving rise to the next, so quickly that it feels like time is flowing, so smoothly that it feels like space is continuous, but underneath there may be no flow at all, just updates, just transitions, just changes from one configuration to another. And if that's true, then the world you experience is not a continuous existence. It's a constantly refreshed pattern, a sequence of states stitched together into something that feels stable. Now, pause again, because this changes something important. If reality is not continuous, then neither are you. Your sense of being you feels uninterrupted. You feel like the same person, from one moment to the next. But what if that continuity is also constructed? What if you are not a persistent object, but a pattern being recreated again and again and again, each moment slightly different, slightly updated, but similar enough to feel the same, like a flame. A flame looks stable, continuous, but it's not. It is a process. Fuel is consumed, energy is released, particles move, the shape persists, but the substance changes constantly. You are like that, a stable pattern in constant renewal. And that pattern depends on deeper processes you do not control, processes you do not perceive, processes that operate at a level beneath physics. If physics itself is emergent, then your experience is even more so. It sits on top of multiple layers, each one interpreting, simplifying, stabilizing, until what remains is something you can understand, something you can live inside, but not something that is fundamentally real. This creates a strange situation, because it means we are trying to understand reality using tools that were never designed for truth, only for survival. Our intuition, our perception, our sense of continuity, all of it is shaped by usefulness, not accuracy. And usefulness does not require seeing what's real. It only requires seeing what works. So, when we imagine reality as continuous, as stable, as built on fixed laws, we are projecting our own limitations onto it. We are assuming that because it feels that way, it must be that way. But feeling, it is not evidence. And at the deepest level, physics has already begun to move beyond that, describing a reality that is fragmented, probabilistic, relational, and possibly discrete, a reality where continuity is not given, but constructed. And if continuity is constructed, then the stability we rely on is not guaranteed. It is maintained, moment by moment, by processes we don't see. And that leads to a question that is easy to overlook, but difficult to ignore once it appears. What is maintaining it? What is ensuring that each moment follows the last in a way that feels consistent? What is holding the pattern together? Because if that process stops, even briefly, then continuity breaks. And if continuity breaks, then reality, as you experience it, no longer exists. Not gradually, not slowly, but instantly, like a film that stops playing. The frames are still there, but the motion is gone. And without motion, there is no story, no time, no experience, nothing. So the question becomes not just what reality is, but what keeps it running, what keeps the pattern stable, what ensures that this moment leads to the next, and whether that process is as permanent as it feels. There is a quiet assumption hidden beneath everything we've talked about so far. An assumption so natural, it almost feels impossible to question. That reality simply exists, that it doesn't need anything to keep it going, that once the universe began, everything else just followed, automatically, continuously, without effort. But if reality is emergent, that assumption becomes unstable, because emergence does not happen on its own. It requires a process. Something has to generate the pattern, something has to maintain it, something has to carry it forward, from one moment to the next. Think about a wave again. A wave doesn't exist by itself. It requires water, it requires motion, it requires energy passing through a medium. Without that, the wave disappears. Not because it was destroyed, but because the process that created it stopped. Now, take that idea and apply it to reality. If everything we experience, space, time, particles, are patterns, then what is the medium? What is the thing that allows those patterns to exist? And more importantly, what is keeping them going? Because patterns don't persist for free. They require continuity. They require structure. They require rules that ensure one state leads to the next. And that begins to sound like something very specific. Not matter, not energy, but information. At a deep level, physics has already started to move in this direction, describing reality not as a collection of things, but as a system that processes information, where every interaction, every event, every change is a transformation from one state of information to another. Particles interact, fields evolve, states update, and the universe continues. Not because it is there, but because it is happening again and again and again. Now pause here, because this changes something subtle but important. If reality is something that happens, then it is not static. It is active. It requires a process. Something like computation. Not necessarily in the way we think about computers, but in a more fundamental sense. A system that takes a state and produces the next state over and over again, following rules, applying transformations, maintaining consistency. This idea has appeared in many different forms: cellular automata, quantum information theory, digital physics, different approaches, but all pointing towards something similar. That the universe might be less like an object and more like a process, a computation unfolding, not running on something, but being the running itself. And if that's true, then reality doesn't just exist. It is being continuously generated, moment by moment, state by state. Now, think about what that implies. If something is being generated, then it depends on the system that generates it. And if that system changes, then the output changes, which means reality itself is not fixed. It is dependent on something deeper. It's something that defines how each moment becomes the next. This leads to a question that is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. What is doing the generating? What is performing this computation? We don't have a clear answer, but we can begin to see the shape of it. It is not located in space, because space is part of the output. It is not moving through time, because time is part of the sequence. It is something beneath both, something that defines the structure of transitions, the logic of change, the rules that produce the rules. And that makes it difficult to imagine, because everything we use to imagine comes from the layer above it. We are trying to picture something that does not exist in the way anything we know exists, but we can still feel its presence indirectly, in the consistency of reality, in the way each moment follows the last, in the way patterns persist, in the way the universe doesn't fall apart. Because if there were no underlying process, no system maintaining the structure, then nothing would hold together. There would be no continuity, no stability, no experience, just disconnected states with no relationship between them. But that's not what we observe. We observe order, we observe persistence, we observe rules, which suggests there is something underneath ensuring that persistence. Now, here is where the idea becomes slightly unsettling. Because if reality depends on an underlying process, then that process becomes the most fundamental thing. Not particles, not space, not time, but the system that generates them. And we don't know what that system is. We don't know its limits. We don't know its stability. We don't know if it can change, or fail, or stop. And if it did, even for a moment, everything we experience would vanish, not explode, not collapse, just stop being generated, like a program that stops running. The data might still exist in some abstract sense, but the experience, the continuity, the unfolding of reality would be gone, and you would never notice. Because noticing requires the process to be active. Now, take a step back, because this is where everything begins to connect. Physics might be emergent, space and time might be emergent, your experience, your identity, your sense of continuity, all emergent, all dependent on something deeper, something that operates beneath everything, quietly, constantly, maintaining the pattern, keeping the system running, and we exist inside the output of that system, experiencing a reality that feels stable, feels continuous, feels real, but only because something underneath has not stopped yet. And that leads to a final thought, for now. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet enough to stay with you a little longer than it should. If reality is something that is being generated, then the question is not just what it is. The question is how long it has been running and whether it is meant to run forever. If reality is something that is being generated, then it is not infinite in the way we imagine. Not necessarily. Because every process, no matter how abstract, has constraints, limits, boundaries that define what it can do and what it cannot. We don't usually think about reality this way. We imagine the universe as something continuous, endless, infinitely detailed. You can zoom in forever, zoom out forever. There is always more. But that assumption comes from intuition, not from physics. Because when physics looks closer, really closer, something unexpected appears, a limit. There is a smallest meaningful scale, a point beyond which our current understanding breaks down. Not because we lack better tools, but because the concept itself stops making sense. Space cannot be divided forever. Time cannot be sliced into infinitely smaller moments. There is a boundary where the idea of smaller no longer applies. This is sometimes described as a kind of resolution limit, like pixels on a screen. From a distance, everything looks smooth, continuous, but zoom in far enough, and the illusion breaks. You start to see the structure, the discreteness, the underlying grid. Reality might be like that. Not truly continuous, but extremely fine. So fine that it feels continuous. Now, combine that idea with everything we've discussed so far. If reality is emergent, and if it is generated, and if it has limits, then it begins to look less like a boundless existence and more like a system with constraints, a system that cannot do everything, a system that must allocate resources. That must decide how much detail, how much complexity, how much information can exist at once. This idea appears in physics in subtle ways. There are limits to how much information can be stored in a region of space, limits to how much can happen in a given time, limits to how precisely things can be known, not technological limits, not limitations of measurement, but fundamental ones, built into the structure of reality itself. And that is strange. Because if reality were truly fundamental, why would it have limits? Why would there be boundaries on information, on precision, on complexity? Limits make sense for systems, for processes, for things that operate under constraints, but not for something that simply exists, unless existence itself is constrained. Now pause here, because this is where the idea becomes more than philosophical. It becomes structural. If there are limits to information, then there is a maximum amount of reality that can exist in a given region, a maximum complexity, a maximum detail. And beyond that, something has to give. Information must be compressed, simplified, or not generated at all. This leads to a strange possibility that reality does not render everything with equal detail, that some parts of the universe might be described at a lower resolution. Because they don't need to be more detailed, not for the system to remain consistent, not for the patterns to hold. This is not a claim. But it is a direction that some theories hint toward. That what we experience as a rich, continuous universe might be a highly optimized structure, efficient, minimal, generating just enough detail to maintain consistency, but not more. Now, think about your own experience. You feel like you are surrounded by an incredibly detailed world. Every object, every surface, every distance feels fully real, fully defined. But is it? Right now, there are parts of your environment you are not looking at, details you are not processing, information that exists but is not being actively used. Your brain does not simulate everything equally. It focuses, prioritizes, simplifies, rendering detail where it matters, and reducing detail where it doesn't, not because it's flawed, but because it's efficient. Now extend that idea outward. What if reality itself is doing something similar? Not conscious, not intentional, but structured in a way that optimizes stability, that maintains consistency, with minimal complexity. This would explain why the universe feels simple at its deepest level, why a small set of rules can describe so much, why equations can capture vast systems, because beneath the complexity there is compression, a reduction of possibilities into stable patterns, patterns that can persist, patterns that can be generated efficiently. Now, here is the part that lingers. If reality has limits, then those limits are not arbitrary. They define what is possible and what is not. They define how much can exist, how much can happen, how much can be experienced, which means there are things that cannot exist, not because they are forbidden, but because there is no capacity for them, no room in the system, no way to generate that level of complexity, and we have no idea where those limits truly are. We are operating far below them, or perhaps closer than we think. Because if reality is a process, then it is running within constraints, and constraints can be reached pushed or exceeded, and if they are exceeded, the system must respond, not by breaking, but by adapting, simplifying, reducing, or changing its behavior in ways we may not understand. Now, step back one more time, because this is where everything begins to feel different. Reality is not infinite, not continuous, not fundamentally stable. It is emergent, generated, constrained, maintained within limits, and we exist inside those limits, experiencing a version of reality that feels complete, feels continuous, feels real, but only because it fits within what is possible. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If reality has limits, then the question is not just what those limits are. The question is, what happens when we get close to them? There is a subtle shift that happens when you start thinking about limits. At first, limits feel distant, abstract, something far away at the edges of the universe. But if reality itself has limits, then those limits are not just out there. They are everywhere, right here, right now, built into every moment you experience. Because if there is a maximum amount of information, a maximum level of detail, then every part of reality must obey it. Not just the distant galaxies, but this room, this moment, even you. That means something important. The world you see is not infinitely detailed. It cannot be. No matter how real it feels, no matter how continuous it seems, there is always a boundary to how much is actually there. And that boundary is not something you can see directly, but sometimes you can feel its effects in subtle ways, easy to dismiss, easy to overlook. But once you notice them, they're difficult to ignore. Take randomness, true randomness. At the quantum level, events appear unpredictable. Particles behave in ways that cannot be determined in advance. Outcomes are not fixed. They are probabilities. And when measured, one possibility becomes real. This is often described as fundamental randomness, something built into reality itself. But there is another way to look at it, not as randomness, but as limitation. A limit on how much information can exist. A limit on how precisely reality can be defined. Instead of every detail being fully determined, the system leaves room for uncertainty. Not because it wants to, but because it has to. Because complete precision would require more information than the system can support. So it doesn't specify everything. It allows possibilities, and only resolves them when necessary. When interaction happens, when measurement occurs, like a system that doesn't compute everything in advance, only what needs to be computed, only when it needs to be known. Now pause, because this idea quietly changes how you interpret reality. What if uncertainty is not a flaw, but a feature? Not a bug, but a constraint? A way of managing complexity, a way of staying within limits. If that's true, then the universe is not fully defined at all times. Some parts of it are left unresolved, not yet decided, existing as possibilities until something forces a resolution. This would explain why observation matters, why interaction changes outcomes, why measurement seems to collapse uncertainty into reality. Because it is not revealing a pre-existing state. It is forcing the system to choose one, to commit, to resolve ambiguity into something definite. And that resolution costs something: information, structure, a move from possibility to reality, which suggests something subtle. Reality might not be fully real until it is interacted with, until it is observed, until it becomes necessary for it to be defined. Now, this doesn't mean nothing exists without observation, but it might mean not everything exists in full detail. Not everything is fully determined until it needs to be. This is a strange idea, because it suggests that reality is not completely fixed, not fully rendered, but partially open, waiting for interaction, for resolution, for something to bring it into definition. Now think about what that implies. If reality is constrained, and if it only resolves detail when necessary, then the world you experience is not a fully defined structure. It is a dynamically maintained one, adjusting, responding, balancing between possibility and reality. And most of the time, you never notice, because your experience is already simplified, already filtered, already resolved into something stable. But at the edges, at the limits, things become less clear, less defined, more uncertain, and that uncertainty might not be accidental. It might be a sign, a signal that you are approaching the boundary of what the system can support. Now take this one step further. If there are limits, then there are edges, not necessarily in space, but in structure, in complexity, in what can be defined. And if you move toward those edges, reality might behave differently, less stable, less predictable, not because the laws are breaking, but because the system is reaching its limits. Like a simulation approaching maximum capacity, things don't immediately collapse, but they become unstable, approximate, less precise. Now step back, because this is where everything becomes quietly unsettling. We assume that reality is fully real, fully defined, fully there. But what if it isn't? What if it is only as detailed as it needs to be, only as precise as it can afford to be, only as stable as the underlying system allows, and beyond that, there is nothing more to see. Not because there is nothing there, but because nothing more can be generated. And if that's true, then the universe is not just something we live in. It is something that is being carefully maintained, balanced, held together within limits we don't perceive, and we are here, inside that balance, experiencing a reality that feels complete, but might only be just enough. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If reality only becomes fully defined when it needs to be, then the question is not just what exists. The question is, what is still waiting to be decided? There is something strange about the role you play in all of this. Up until now, it has been possible to think of yourself as separate, an observer, a passive presence inside a system that runs on its own. Reality exists, and you experience it. Simple, clean, comforting. But the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to maintain that separation, because something unusual keeps appearing again and again. At the smallest scales, the act of observation seems to matter, not in a philosophical sense, but in a physical one. Experiments in quantum physics have revealed something that doesn't fit neatly into our expectations. Particles do not behave as fixed objects. They exist in possibilities, multiple states, at once. Until something happens, until an interaction, until a measurement, until observation. And then, suddenly, those possibilities collapse into a single outcome, not gradually, not partially, but definitively. One state becomes real, the others disappear. Now, pause here. Because this is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean that human consciousness is magically creating reality. That's too simple, too dramatic. But it does mean something else, something quieter. That interaction matters. That being part of the system changes the system. That observation is not separate from reality. It is part of the process that defines it. And that changes something fundamental, because it means you are not just watching reality unfold. You are participating in it at a deep level. Every time you interact, every time you observe, every time information is exchanged, the system updates. A possibility becomes a fact. A pattern becomes defined. And this ties back to something we've already seen. Reality may not be fully determined at all times. It may exist as possibilities, until something forces a resolution. And you, in your own small way, are part of that process, not controlling it, not directing it, but participating in it. Now, this doesn't mean you can shape reality at will. That's not how it works. The system is far larger than you, far more complex. But it does mean that reality is not completely independent of interaction. It is not a finished structure waiting to be observed. It is something that becomes defined through interaction, through participation, through the exchange of information. Now take a step back, because this creates a subtle shift. If reality depends on interaction, and if interaction requires participants, then the structure of reality is not just about what exists. It is about relationships, connections, the ways in which parts of the system influence each other. And this aligns with something we touched on earlier, that the deepest layer of reality may not be made of objects, but of relationships. And if that's true, then you are not just an object in the universe. You are a node, a point of interaction, a place where information flows, where patterns meet, where possibilities resolve. And that makes your role subtle, but not insignificant, because every interaction helps define the structure of reality at that moment. Not globally, not completely, but locally, in small ways, in ways that accumulate. Now, this leads to a question that is easy to overlook. If reality is only partially defined until interaction occurs, then what about the parts you are not interacting with? What about the distant stars, the empty regions of space, the particles far beyond any measurement? Are they fully defined? Or do they exist in a less specific state? Not non-existent, but not fully resolved, not completely determined, waiting, in a sense, for interaction, for information to flow, for definition to occur. This is not something we can easily test, but it is a logical extension of what we observe. And it suggests something strange, that reality is not equally real everywhere. not in the sense of existence, but in the sense of definition. Some parts of the universe are fully resolved, fully structured. Others may be more open, more uncertain, more potential than actual. And the difference comes down to interaction, to whether information has been exchanged. Now, pause again, because this idea quietly dissolves a boundary. The boundary between observer and reality. You are not outside the system. You are inside it. Part of the process that defines it. And that means there is no clear separation between what is real and what is observed. Those two things are deeply connected, entangled. Now, step back one more time, because this is where everything begins to converge. Reality is emergent. It is generated. It has limits. It is not fully defined at all times, and it becomes structured through interaction, through relationships, through participation. And you are one of those participants, not central, not special, but not irrelevant either. You are part of the system that keeps reality coherent, that helps define patterns, that contributes to the unfolding of each moment, quietly, constantly, without ever noticing. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If reality becomes defined through interaction, then the question is not just what exists. The question is, how much of it is still unresolved? There is one more piece that quietly connects everything we've explored so far. Something that doesn't just challenge what reality is made of, but how it is held together. Because if reality is emergent, and if it is built from relationships, then those relationships must connect everything. Not loosely, not occasionally, but fundamentally, at a level we don't directly see. There is a phenomenon in physics, subtle, but deeply unsettling once you think about it. Two particles can become linked, not through distance, not through force, but through correlation. They become part of a single system, even when separated, even when moved far apart. This is often called entanglement, and what it reveals is something difficult to accept. That separation might not be as real as it feels. When two particles are entangled, the state of one is connected to the state of the other, instantly. Not through a signal, not through a delay, but as if they are not truly separate to begin with. Now pause here, because this doesn't mean information is traveling faster than light. That would be too simple. Instead, it suggests something deeper, that what we perceive as two distinct objects are actually part of a single underlying structure, a shared pattern, and that pattern exists beneath space, because space would require distance, and distance would require separation, but entanglement seems to ignore both, which means the deeper layer of reality is not organized by space, not in the way we understand it. It is organized by relationships, connections, patterns of interaction that do not depend on distance. Now, take that idea and expand it. If small systems can be entangled, then larger systems can too. And if that's true, then reality itself might be a vast network of relationships, not a collection of separate things, but a single, interconnected structure, where what appears separate is only separate at the surface, at the emergent layer. But beneath that, everything is linked. Everything is part of the same system. Now, think about what that implies. The idea of here and there might not be fundamental. The idea of this and that might not be fundamental. Even the idea of you and everything else might not be fundamental. These are distinctions that emerge at higher levels, useful, practical, necessary for experience, but not true at the deepest layer. Because at that level, there is no separation, only structure, only relationships, only a single system, expressing itself in different ways. And that makes something very familiar feel slightly different. Your sense of being an independent entity, separate from the world, moving through the space, interacting with things that exist outside of you. That sense might not reflect the true structure of reality. It might be a feature of the emergent layer, a useful illusion, a way of simplifying a deeply interconnected system into something manageable, something that feels stable, something that feels separate. Because without that simplification, experience would be overwhelming, impossible to navigate. So the system presents itself as divided, as objects, as boundaries, as individuals, even though underneath, those divisions may not exist. Now pause again, because this is where the idea becomes quietly profound. If everything is connected at a fundamental level, then nothing exists in isolation. Not truly. Every particle, every field, every structure is part of a larger pattern, influenced by everything else, defined by relationships, and that includes you. You are not separate from reality. You are a configuration within it, a pattern in the network, a localized structure that appears distinct but is fundamentally connected. Now, this doesn't mean you can feel those connections or control them. They exist at a level beneath perception, beneath intuition. But they are there, holding the system together, ensuring consistency, maintaining coherence. Because if reality were truly separate, if everything were independent, there would be no reason for it to behave consistently, no reason for patterns to persist, no reason for laws to appear stable. But if everything is connected, then consistency emerges naturally, because the system is not made of isolated parts. It is a single structure, evolving as a whole. Now step back, because this is where everything begins to align. Reality is emergent, it is generated, it has limits, it is not fully defined until interaction occurs, and beneath it all, it is connected, deeply, fundamentally, in ways that ignore space, distance, separation, which means the universe is not a collection of things, it is a relationship, a process, a single, continuous system, appearing as many. And we exist inside that appearance, experiencing division, where there may be none, experiencing separation, where there may only be connection. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If everything is connected at the deepest level, then the question is not just what reality is made of. The question is why it appears as if it isn't. There is something we rarely question because it feels too reliable to doubt. The laws of physics. They feel absolute, unchanging, the same everywhere, the same every time. Gravity pulls Light travels. Energy is conserved. These are not suggestions, they are rules. Or at least, that's how they appear. But if everything we've explored so far is even partially true, then those laws become something else. Not fundamental truths, but patterns. Stable patterns. Consistent behaviors that emerge from deeper processes, and that changes how we should think about them. Because patterns can persist for a long time. They can appear permanent, but they are not guaranteed. They exist, as long as the conditions that produce them remain stable. And when those conditions change, the pattern changes too. You've seen this before. Water flows until it freezes. Then it becomes rigid. The same molecules, the same underlying structure, but completely different behavior. The rules changed. Not because something broke, but because the system entered a different state. Now, take that idea and apply it to physics itself. What if the laws we observe are not fixed laws, but stable behaviors of a particular state of reality, a phase, a configuration, one that happens to be extremely consistent, extremely stable, but not fundamental, not inevitable, just persistent? This would explain something that has always been slightly mysterious. Qui soit, why the laws of physics are so simple, why a small set of equations can describe so much, why the universe behaves in such a regular way. Because simplicity is a sign of stability, a sign that the system has settled into a pattern that repeats, that holds, that doesn't fluctuate wildly. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way. It just means it currently is. Now pause, because this is where the idea becomes subtle. If laws are patterns, then they don't enforce reality. They describe it. They are not rules that the universe follows. They are summaries of how it behaves. And if the behavior changes, the laws change with it. Not because they were broken, but because they were never the source. They were the result. This flips something fundamental. Instead of thinking the laws create reality, we begin to see reality produces the laws. And that shift is quiet, but profound. Because it means there is no guarantee that the laws we observe are universal, not in the deepest sense. They may be local, context-dependent, emerging from the specific structure of our universe. And if that structure were different, the laws would be different too. Now, think about what that implies. There could be regions of reality, not necessarily far away in space, but deeper, where the patterns change, where gravity behaves differently, where time flows differently, where the concept of a particle no longer applies. Not because something went wrong, but because the underlying structure is different. Because the system is in a different state. Now step back. Because this is where things become quietly unsettling. We trust the laws of physics because they have always worked. They have never failed us. They predict, they explain, they hold, but that trust is based on observation, on consistency, not on necessity. We assume they are permanent because they have not changed within our experience, but our experience is limited. Extremely limited in time, in scale, in depth. We are observing a tiny slice of a much larger system, a system that may have existed in different states, before we arrived, and may exist in different states long after we are gone. Now here is the part that lingers. If the laws of physics are not fundamental, then they do not have to remain stable. They only need to remain stable as long as the underlying structure remains the same. And we do not know how stable that structure is. It may be incredibly stable, lasting billions, trillions of years, or it may be slowly changing in ways too subtle for us to notice, drifting, adjusting, evolving, not dramatically, but gradually, so slowly that within a human lifetime, everything appears constant, but over vast scales, the pattern shifts. And if the pattern shifts, the laws shift with it. Now imagine that, not as a sudden collapse, but as a transition, a phase change in the structure of reality itself, where the rules we rely on quietly stop applying, not all at once, but piece by piece, until the world we understand is no longer the same, not destroyed, but transformed. Now pause again, because this is not something we can easily detect. If the laws changed slowly, our measurements would change with them. Our instruments, our standards, our references, everything we use to define reality would adapt to the new pattern, and we would not notice, because we are part of the system. We change with it. We measure it from inside it. Which means, if reality is shifting, we may have no external reference to detect it. Now, step back one final time, because this is where everything becomes clear. Physics is not the foundation. It is the pattern, a stable pattern that emerges from deeper structure, a pattern we have learned to describe but not to explain at its root. And that pattern feels permanent, feels absolute, feels real, but only because it has not changed yet. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If the laws of physics are just stable patterns, then the question is not just why they exist. The question is how long they will continue to hold. There is something unusual about the stability of reality, not just that it exists, but that it holds together, consistently, reliably, for as long as it has. Because if everything we've explored is true, if reality is emergent, if it is generated, if it depends on deeper structure, then stability is not guaranteed. It is something that must be explained. Why does the system not fluctuate wildly? Why does it not constantly change? Why do the patterns we observe persist long enough for galaxies to form, for stars to burn, for life to emerge? Because emergence alone does not create stability. It creates possibility. It allows patterns to form, but it does not ensure they will last. Most patterns fade quickly. They form and then dissolve. They appear and then disappear. That is the natural behavior of complex systems, temporary structures, short-lived configurations. But our universe is different. It has patterns that endure, structures that remain stable over enormous spans of time. And that is not something we should take for granted. It is something that needs an explanation. One possibility is that stability itself is emergent, not imposed, not designed, but selected. In a system with many possible configurations, some will be unstable. They will collapse quickly. disappear, leave no trace. Others will persist, not because they are perfect, but because they are stable enough. Stable enough to continue existing, stable enough to reproduce their structure, stable enough to maintain coherence over time, and once such patterns appear, they dominate, because everything else fades away. This is a kind of selection, not biological, but structural, a filtering process where only stable configurations remain and everything unstable is naturally removed. Now, pause, because this idea quietly explains something profound. Why the universe appears ordered, why it appears structured, why it appears governed by consistent laws. Not because order is fundamental, but because disorder does not last. Unstable realities do not persist long enough to be observed. They vanish, they collapse, they never form a consistent pattern. So what remains, what we experience, is the subset of reality that is stable enough to exist. Now take that one step further. If only stable patterns persist, then the laws of physics we observe may not be arbitrary. They may be the result of this selection process. The specific patterns that can maintain stability at the deepest level. Not the only possible ones, but the ones that last. This would explain something that has always been puzzling. Why the universe seems fine-tuned. Why the constants of physics fall within narrow ranges that allow structure to exist, stars, atoms, galaxies. If those constants were different, even slightly, the universe might not support stable structures at all. Everything might collapse too quickly, or never form. And in that case, there would be nothing to observe, no one to ask the question. So, we find ourselves in a universe where the conditions allow stability, not necessarily because it was designed that way, but because only such universes can persist long enough to be experienced. Now step back, because this reframes something important. The universe does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be stable, stable enough to maintain patterns, stable enough to support complexity, stable enough to allow observers to emerge, and that may be all it is, a stable configuration among many possibilities. Now here is where the idea deepens. If stability is selected, then the system itself may be exploring possibilities, not consciously, not intentionally, but structurally. Different configurations, different patterns, different rules, arising and fading until stable ones remain. And those stable ones become reality, at least for a time. This suggests something subtle. Reality, as we experience it, is not just a fixed state. It may be part of a process, a larger exploration of what is possible, where stable structures emerge, persist, and eventually may change. Now, pause again, because this is where the idea becomes quietly humbling. The universe we inhabit may not be the only way reality can exist. It may not be the final form. It may not even be the most stable one. It is simply a stable one. One that has lasted long enough for us to appear inside it and to begin asking questions about it. Now think about that. Everything you know, everything you trust, everything you experience exists within a pattern that happens to be stable, not because it must be, but because it is. And that stability may not last forever. Not because something will break, but because the system itself may continue to evolve, to shift, to explore new configurations. And, if that happens, the patterns we rely on may not remain the same. Now step back one final time, because this is where everything becomes clear again. Reality is not fixed. It is not guaranteed. It is not fundamentally stable. It is conditionally stable, maintained because the current configuration works, because it holds together, because it persists, and we exist inside that persistence, experiencing it as something solid, something reliable, something real, but only because it has not yet changed. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If stability is not guaranteed, then the question is not just why reality exists. The question is how long this particular version of it can continue to hold together. There is a point where every explanation begins to slow down. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because the concepts themselves start to lose meaning. Up until now, we've been moving deeper, peeling back layers, from particles to fields, to patterns, to relationships, to processes, each step bringing us closer to something more fundamental, something beneath. But there is a question that quietly waits at the bottom of all of this. What happens when there are no more layers to peel? What happens when we reach the end of explanation, or something that feels like the end? Because every time we describe reality, we do it using concepts from the layer we understand: space, time, objects, cause and effect. Even when we try to go deeper, we still rely on those ideas. We stretch them, we reshape them, but we never fully escape them. No, and that creates a limitation, because if the deepest layer of reality does not resemble anything from our experience, then we may not have the tools to describe it, or even to think about it clearly. We might be reaching a boundary, not of reality, but of understanding. Now pause here, because this is not a failure. It is a natural consequence of how we exist. Our minds evolved to navigate the world, not to fully comprehend the deepest structure of reality. We are adapted to the emergent layer, the stable one, the predictable one, the one where space feels real, time flows forward, and objects behave consistently. But the deeper layer may not follow those rules. It may not have space. It may not have time. It may not have objects. It may not even have things in any recognizable sense. Only structure, only relationships, only processes that do not map onto our intuition. And when we try to imagine that, our minds begin to fail. Not dramatically, but subtly. We fall back on familiar ideas. We picture something. We assign shape. We assign form, even when we know those shapes are wrong, because without them, we have nothing to hold on to. Now, think about that. The deepest layer of reality may exist in a form that we cannot visualize, cannot directly describe, cannot truly understand. Not because it is hidden, but because it is fundamentally different from anything we have evolved to perceive. This creates a strange situation. We can infer its existence. We can build models. We can describe its effects. But we cannot fully grasp what it is. It remains just out of reach. Now step back, because this is where the idea becomes quietly profound. Everything we call real, everything we experience, everything we trust, exists at a level that is already simplified, already translated, already reduced into something our minds can process. But beneath that, there may be a layer that has no such translation, no simplified form, no intuitive version, only raw structure, and we are not built to see it. Now, this does not mean we can never understand it at all. Mathematics allows us to go further than intuition, to describe things we cannot picture, to explore structures we cannot experience directly. But even mathematics has limits. It relies on symbols, on logic, on frameworks. And those frameworks are still grounded in the way we understand patterns, which means there may still be aspects of reality that lie beyond even that, not just unseen, but unrepresentable. Now, pause again, because this leads to a subtle shift. Instead of asking what is the deepest layer of reality, we may need to ask, can the deepest layer be understood at all? Not fully, not completely, not in a way that maps onto our experience. And if that's true, then the search for a final explanation may not end with a clear answer. It may end with a boundary, a point where we can describe what reality does, but not what it is. Now, think about how different that is, and from how we usually imagine knowledge. We assume that if we keep asking questions, we will eventually arrive at a final truth, a clear foundation, something simple, something complete. But reality may not be structured that way. It may not have a final layer that we can fully grasp. Only deeper layers, each one more abstract, more removed from intuition, until explanation itself reaches its limit. And beyond that, there is something that simply is, without needing to be understood, without needing to be explained. Now step back one final time, because this is where everything settles. Reality is emergent. It is generated. It has limits. It is not fully defined. It is deeply connected. Its laws are patterns. Its stability is conditional. And beneath all of that, there may be a layer that we can approach, but never fully reach. And we are here, inside a version of reality that is understandable enough to feel real, but not deep enough to reveal everything. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If the deepest layer of reality cannot be fully understood, then the question is not just what lies beneath everything. The question is, how much of it we were never meant to see? There is one final layer that is easy to forget. Not because it is unimportant, but because it feels too personal to question. Meaning, the sense that things matter, that events have purpose, that existence itself has direction. We rarely stop to examine this, because meaning feels natural. It feels like part of reality, like something built into the universe. But if everything we've explored is true, then meaning may not be fundamental either. It may be emergent, just like space, just like time, just like the laws of physics. Now pause, because this is not a negative idea. It is simply a shift, a different way of understanding something we usually take for granted. Meaning feels real, deeply real. It shapes decisions, it guides behavior, It gives structure to experience, but where does it come from? Not from particles, not from fields, not from equations. There is nothing in the fundamental description of reality that contains meaning. Only interactions, only relationships, only processes. Meaning appears at a higher level, when patterns become complex enough to interpret themselves, to reflect, to assign significance. In other words, meaning does not exist at the base layer. It emerges when systems become capable of experiencing, and we are one of those systems. Now, think about that. The universe does not contain meaning in the way it contains matter. Meaning arises when certain patterns form. Patterns like minds, patterns like consciousness, patterns like you. And once those patterns exist, they begin to interpret reality, to categorize it, to assign value, to create narratives. And from that, meaning appears, not imposed from outside, not embedded in the structure of the universe itself, but generated from within the system. Now, pause again, because this idea can feel unsettling at first. If meaning is emergent, then it is not absolute. It is not fixed. It depends on the structure that produces it, which means it can vary, change, disappear, just like any other emergent property. But there is another way to see this, a quieter way. If meaning is emergent, then it is not limited to a single source. It is not something that must be given. It is something that can arise wherever the right conditions exist. And that makes it, in a sense, more flexible, more adaptable, more open. Now, step back, because this connects to everything we've explored. Reality is not a fixed structure. It is a process, a system of relationships, a network of interactions, from which patterns emerge. And among those patterns, some become stable, some become complex, and some become aware. And with awareness comes interpretation. And with interpretation comes meaning, not as a fundamental layer, but as a consequence, a natural result of complexity reaching a certain point. Now, think about how this changes things. Instead of asking, what is the meaning of the universe? We might ask, how does meaning arise within it? Not as something to be found, but as something that forms, through structure, through experience, through interaction. And that makes meaning part of the same process as everything else. Emergent, dependent, real, but not fundamental. Now pause again, because this leads to something subtle. If meaning emerges from patterns, then as long as those patterns exist, meaning exists. Not universally, not identically, but locally, within each system that can experience it, which means meaning does not need to be built into the universe. It only needs to be possible, and it is, because you are here, because you can experience, because you can interpret, because you can feel that things matter. Now, step back one final time, because this is where everything comes together. Physics may not be fundamental, space and time may not be fundamental. Reality itself may be emergent, generated, constrained, connected, and even meaning may arise from that same process. Not separate from it, but part of it. A higher level pattern, built on top of everything else. And we exist inside that pattern, experiencing a world that feels structured, feels real, feels meaningful, but only because the system has reached a level where such experiences can occur. And that leads to a final thought for now, a quiet one. If meaning is something that emerges, then the question is not just what the universe means. The question is what kinds of meaning it is capable of becoming. At this point, something subtle has changed, not in the universe, but in the way you see it, because piece by piece, layer by layer, the idea of reality as something fixed, something absolute, something final, has begun to dissolve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, almost gently. Physics no longer feels like a foundation. It feels like a pattern. Space no longer feels like a container. It feels like a result. Time no longer feels like a constant flow. It feels like something constructed. And even your sense of self no longer feels like a fixed thing, but a process, a pattern that continues moment by moment. Now pause, because this is where everything comes together. If all of these things are emergent, then what you experience as reality is not the base layer. It is the surface, a stable surface, a consistent one, but still a surface. And surfaces can be misleading. They feel solid, they feel complete, but they hide what lies beneath. Now think about how often you rely on that surface. Every decision, every perception, every assumption, all of it is based on the idea that the world is as it appears, that space is real, that time flows, that objects exist. And for practical purposes, that is true. It works, it is consistent enough to trust. But at a deeper level, it may not be what it seems. It may be a translation, a simplified interface built on top of something far more complex, something far less intuitive, something that does not resemble anything you directly experience. Now step back, because this creates a quiet tension. You are living inside a reality that feels completely real, but may only be a representation, a version of something deeper. And that representation is all you have access to. You cannot step outside it. You cannot observe the underlying layer directly. You can only infer it, model it, imagine it through the limits of your perception. And those limits are built into the system. You are not separate from reality. That you are part of the layer that is being generated, which means your understanding of reality is shaped by the same processes that create it. Now, pause again, because this is where the idea becomes quietly profound. If reality is an emergent layer, then everything that feels fundamental is only fundamental within that layer, not beyond it. The laws of physics, the flow of time, the structure of space, they are stable within the system, but they do not define the system itself. They arise from it. And that means there is always something deeper, not necessarily in space, not necessarily in time, but in structure, in process, in the way reality organizes itself at its most fundamental level. And that deeper layer may not resemble anything we recognize. It may not have objects, it may not have dimensions, it may not have continuity. Only relationships, only transitions, only something that gives rise to everything else. Now, Think about what that implies. Everything you experience, every moment, every thought, every sensation exists within a layer. That is not the final one, a layer that depends on something else, and that something else is not directly accessible. Now, step back one more time, because this is where the perspective shifts completely. Instead of asking, what is reality made of? You begin to ask, what level of reality am I in? Not in a science fiction sense, not as a simulation, but as a structure, a hierarchy, where each layer emerges from the one beneath it, and each layer feels complete to whatever exists inside it, which means, from your perspective, this reality feels final. It feels like the base, because it is the only layer you can experience directly. But that does not make it the deepest one. It only makes it your layer. Now pause, because this is where everything becomes very quiet. You are here, inside a system that is stable enough, consistent enough, coherent enough to feel real, to feel complete, to feel fundamental. But beneath that, something else is happening, something that produces everything you experience without being anything you can perceive. And that process has been running for as long as reality has existed, maintaining the pattern, holding the structure together, allowing each moment to follow the last. Now step back one final time, because this is where the idea settles. Reality is not what it seems, not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. It is a layer, a stable one, a reliable one, but not the deepest one. And we are here, inside it, experiencing it as everything, because it is everything we can experience. And that leads to a final thought before the end, a quiet one. If reality is only a layer, then the question is not just what lies beneath it. The question is, why this layer feels so convincingly real. There is something strange about reaching the end of a question, not because the answer appears, but because the question itself changes. At the beginning, this was about physics, about whether the laws of reality are truly fundamental, whether space, time, matter are the base layer. But now that question feels smaller, because what we've uncovered is something deeper, that physics may not be the foundation, that reality may not be fixed, that everything we experience may be part of a process, something forming, something emerging, something that depends on something else. And that realization doesn't arrive with a loud conclusion. It arrives quietly, like a shift in perspective, like looking at something familiar and suddenly realizing it was never what you thought it was. Now pause, because this is where most explanations would try to end, with an answer, a final statement, and a clear definition of reality. But that's not what happens here, because the deeper we go, the less reality looks like something that can be fully defined. It looks more like something that is continuously becoming, not a structure, but a process, not a fixed system, but a dynamic one, something that unfolds moment by moment, from a layer we do not directly see. Now think about everything you've experienced, your sense of time passing, your sense of space around you, your sense of being a self, moving through a world. All of it feels immediate, feels real, feels undeniable, and in a practical sense, it is. But at a deeper level, it may all be part of the same emergent layer, a layer that feels complete only because it is stable enough, consistent enough, to convince you that it is the foundation. Now step back, because this is where something subtle happens. The universe begins to feel different, not less real, but less final, less like something built, and more like something that is still forming, still unfolding, still dependent on deeper structure. And you are part of that unfolding, not outside it, not observing it from a distance, but inside it, as a pattern, as a process, as something that exists because the system is currently holding together. Now, pause again, because this is not meant to take something away. It's not meant to make reality feel empty. If anything, it does the opposite. Because if reality is emergent, then it is not static. It is alive with possibility, open, not fully determined, not completely fixed. And that means the story is not finished, not at the level of the universe, and not at the level of you. Now think about that. You are not a fixed object in a finished world. You are a pattern in a system that is still unfolding, still forming, still becoming something it has not yet fully become. And that gives your existence a different kind of weight, not because it is predetermined, but because it is part of the process, part of the emergence, part of the structure that is still being defined. Now, step back one last time, because this is where everything settles into place. We started with a simple idea. What if physics is not fundamental? And we followed it, step by step, layer by layer, until it led somewhere unexpected. To a view of reality that is not fixed, not final, not fully understood, but deeply structured, deeply connected, and still unfolding. And in that view, the universe is not just something that exists. It is something that happens, continuously, quietly, without ever stopping. And you are part of that happening, right now, in this moment. Whether you think about it or not, whether you understand it or not, you are part of the process that gives rise to reality as it is. Now pause, because this is the last idea, and it's a simple one. If reality is not fundamental, if it is emergent, if it is still forming, then the question is not just what it is made of. The question is what it is becoming, and whether we are only seeing the beginning of it, or something closer to the middle. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not the idea that reality is unstable, not the idea that it is incomplete, but the idea that it is still in motion, still unfolding, still becoming something we cannot yet see. If this idea stayed with you even a little longer than expected, you're not alone. There's something about these questions that doesn't end when the video ends. They linger, they follow you, quietly. So if you want to explore more ideas like this, the kind that don't just explain the universe, but slowly change the way you see it, you can stay here. There's always another layer, another question, another perspective waiting. And until then, just remember this. The world you experience feels solid, feels complete, feels real, but it may only be one version of something much deeper, still unfolding.